There's a minute there that you go, well, do I want to be the third Batman in the fourth Batman picture? The other three were very successful, and the only thing you can do is screw it up.
I'm here to talk to you about everybody's least favorite Batman, George Clooney. The man who is largely regarded as the worst ever live-action Batman. But then again, I would think it'd be hard to be a good Batman when you're in the worst Batman movie. The truth of the matter is that by time Clooney was cast, no one really cared about Batman. At least not anybody in the studio. The character was nothing more than a prop to sell toys, a means to make money, a mascot. And yeah, sure, you can make an argument that pretty much that's what the business is, but at least before there was something genuine and meaningful to his previous presence. There is nothing heartfelt about this iteration of Batman. He looks, acts, and sounds nothing like either one of his predecessors. And even worst off is that he looks, acts, and sounds nothing like Batman. The character barely resembles the character that we know outside of name and costume. Everything that made this character not just iconic, but interesting and unique, were left on the cutting room floor. And I'm gonna be honest, I don't usually blame actors for this type of thing, but in watching some of the behind the scenes footage, and seeing some interviews with George Clooney, it actually seems like he's somewhat to blame.
Some pages originally written that had him, dealing with his parents being dead again. And I said, I don't think anybody is going to feel sorry for and listen to a guy going, woe is me, my parents died when I was 4. He's a 35-year-old guy who lives in a giant mansion and has billions of dollars and goes out with the most beautiful women in the world and has the coolest toys and is Batman.
He didn't want to betray a brooding Batman because he felt that nobody would feel sorry for him. Not realizing that this was a defining personality trait for the character, and not just a lame means of sympathy from an audience. The problem is that Batman is broody. I mean, that guy hasn't been happy since the 60s. That's just not who he is. He's not one to stop and smile. Believe me, the Joker has been barking up that tree for decades now, and got nothing. Well, except for that one time. Although, make no mistake, I don't think George Clooney is alone to blame for any of this, not by a long shot.
Take a major conversational detour.
The original cut of Batman Forever was rumored to be 3 hours long. It still had all those cartoonish elements that you've seen in the final cut of the film, but it was originally meant to better balance them with the darker components of the Tim Burton films. A full hour was eventually cut from the movie, taking away anything that the studio felt was too dark or too mature for a younger audience, as during the time they were afraid of another Batman Returns backlash. Most of what was cut was entire plot surrounding the duality of Bruce Wayne and Batman, exploring the depth of the character and what it means to be Batman. Warner Brothers felt that it was too grown up for the audience they were trying to appeal to, and nixed this entire plot point from the film. And who can blame them? Good filmmaking, what's that? We gotta sell McDonald's mugs, goddammit! Not that I'm complaining, mind you, of course, because those mugs are quite delightful. I still own the full set. Now you may think to yourself, V, are you already going senile at such a young, tender age? You're talking about Batman Forever in a Batman and Robin video. My point here is that Joel Schumacher knew going into this movie that the tortured psyche thing just wasn't gonna cut it with studios. They weren't interested in showcasing that aspect of the character. So instead of giving the audience a Batman with depth and internal struggles, they just gave us a guy in a mask. More than any Batman that came before him, or like any Batman that came after him, George Clooney personifies guy in suit. Because he never feels like a real hero, he feels like a guy in cosplay. Like, I'm sure this man has won a Comic-Con contest in his day, no doubt. But roaming the streets as Gotham's greatest protector? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not buying it. I don't really get that vibe from this guy. But what's really bizarre for me, though, is that they replaced Batman's alleged broodiness with blatant blandness. Point blank, Batman is boring in this. Like, really boring in this. This is such a nothing performance, because there's almost nothing to say about it. George Clooney sleepwalks his way through each and every scene that he's in, and whenever it looks like he's attempting to emulate emotion, for some reason he turns into a bobblehead. I don't know why this happens. I can only imagine that George Clooney must have been short-circuiting that day, which would not surprise me given his robotic portrayal of Bruce Wayne. It feels like there wasn't even an attempt made here. It doesn't feel like he was actually working when he was on set. He was just there for attendance purposes. Every line he delivers feels like it's the first time that he's reading it. And when I say that he delivers every line like he's just reading it, I don't mean like he had the script, read it over once, and then they started rolling. I mean it's as if he's reading it off cue cards held up by Joel Schumacher off camera. And to make matters even worse, he reads out loud like the kid in class you don't want to get called on. Look, I'm not an actor, but this movie makes me think that George Clooney isn't one either. I don't buy a single thing this guy says, and I wouldn't pay him to be Batman. I know that sounds harsh, but this was such a monumental fumble. And what really gets me is that George Clooney isn't a bad actor. He's actually quite talented. He's had some fantastic performances both before and after this movie came out. We're talking about a multiple-time Oscar and Golden Globe winner, a Primetime Emmy nominee, a BAFTA Film Award owner. How could he have given a performance this bad? Did he just not care? Because that's kind of the impression I get with the final product. This guy's just constantly given a smug smirk even in the most inopportune moments.
Alfred's not sick. He's dying.
Dying? I can't believe it.
I know.
Like what the hell, dude? That shouldn't be something you're celebrating. I get that you're George Clooney and the schmug shtick is kind of your thing, but you're not playing George Clooney. You're playing Batman. Be Batman. To be fair, I think that George Clooney would make for an excellent Bruce Wayne. Not Bruce Wayne the person, but Bruce Wayne the persona. I totally buy into this guy being an eligible playboy. Mainly because in real life, that's what George Clooney was. And I think that really works in the few scenes where we see George Clooney as Bruce Wayne public figure. I actually think that that's a part of the character that he pulls off better than Kilmer or Keaton. I know saying Clooney did anything better than those two is probably total blasphemy, but in this one instance, I stand by that statement. He's charming and easily likable, and yet he still has that silent hint of arrogant jerk, which I think is kind of perfect for persona Bruce Wayne. Although in reflecting, I don't think this was done by design. As I alluded to before, George Clooney is playing George Clooney in all of the movie, and George Clooney's real-life public image wasn't all that different from Bruce Wayne. So it's really just one of these instances where a part of the character lined up with a part of the person, not really a creative choice or decision. Unfortunately, the one potential strength that could come from this performance isn't really all that utilized. And quite frankly, Batman and Robin really isn't the right movie to try to utilize that aspect of the character. You know, having Christian Bale's Bruce Wayne rendezvous on the town while Poison Ivy and her plant monsters are taking over a neon-lit night city probably would come off as a little bit laughable. Since this is the Joel Schumacher Tim Burton line of films, there really isn't a separation of Batman and Bruce. And because it's George Clooney in that role, there's also no separation of Bat, Bruce, or George. There's no separations of the character or the actor who is playing him. No differentiating sides whatsoever. It's just the same all throughout. Because of this, he never really comes off as the character. I don't really see him as Bruce Wayne, and I don't really see him as Batman. I just see him for the guy that was poorly chosen to play that character. I think what's most telling is that Batman barely even feels like a fixture in his own movie. And not that that's the only time that that's ever happened in a Batman movie, it is still probably the most unjustifiable time that has ever happened in a Batman movie. I mean, other times it was almost understandable, but like I said, Arnold Schwarzenegger isn't going to be winning an Oscar for his time in the role anytime soon. I don't know, Batman taking a backseat to 3 of the goofiest villains ever brought to the big screen just doesn't seem like a good look. If anything, it's a sad indication of how little he matters at this point. I think when you're talking about Keaton to Kilmer, there are some comparisons to be made between those two performances. And despite this still being meant to be the same line of films, I don't think that you can attempt to do that here, just because of how sad a comparison that would be to try to make. I mean, think of their opening scenes alone. The first time we ever saw this character in this alleged canon was in this iconic scene with this iconic quote.
What are you? I'm Batman.
That was the first introduction we got of Batman. The first introduction we get to the character in the last movie is this.
Hi, Freeze. I'm Batman.
This may just be the biggest downgrade I've ever seen in my life. Look at how these two scenes are similar, but still completely different. In both, Batman is introducing himself to a criminal in the opening of the movie. But in one, Batman is a dark, mysterious, heroic figure who is offering his name up as a threat. And in the other, Batman is casually saying hello before sliding down a dinosaur tail like he's Fred Flintstone. Like, it's so nonchalant that he might as well have just handed him a business card. There is next to no redeeming factors to this performance. There is nothing to this performance. Batman feels like a filler character in his own movie. And George Clooney feels like a filler actor for the character. Like, what were they even casting for? Were they just looking for a chin? They just put him in the suit and then went, that'll do it. The movie almost managed to get absolutely everything wrong about the character. Almost. There is one thing I want to note. The writing for the character in the movie isn't always awful. I mean, it's mostly awful, as we've covered before. It's pretty awful, but there's surprisingly instances of the character we know desperately trying to break through this bad movie and bland characterization. The way Batman handles Mr. Freeze is surprisingly perfect. Knowing the serious threat that he is and the danger he could cause and has caused, Batman still meets Freeze with compassion and empathy. After defeating him, he doesn't take the time to gloat or carelessly apprehend him. He comforts him. Batman reassures Mr. Freeze of his wife's safety and encourages him to both continue his research and choose a better path in life. And I think that's kind of amazing. It's a beautiful moment that really shows Batman's compassion and showcases the character's silent love for humanity. It's kinda sad that such a moment is wasted in a movie like this. I think it stands out as the one thing this movie really did right. The one thing that they really did right by the character. And I think it deserves credit for that. It may have screwed up a whole lot, but it didn't screw all the way up. I think what really stands out about this is that this is something that this movie got right that the other movies didn't manage to. I mean, just look at Batman's history with the villains in the other films. He's responsible for at least one death per movie. Kills the Joker at the end of the first one, kills the Penguin in the second one, kills Two-Face in the third one. I don't care if you say that he just let him die, he enforced his death. So yeah, this is the way that I think Batman would handle this kind of situation. Now granted, it doesn't make up for everything else. This moment is mostly lost in the hilarity of the awfulness that is Batman and Robin, and I understand why. But it's also because of that hilarity and awfulness that this moment stands out that much more to me. I think it's a real touching moment that showcases Batman's humanity in a way that wasn't spotlighted in the previous Batman performances. Nonetheless, George Clooney has definitely earned his spot as the worst Batman of all time. No one is disputing that. Certainly not me. He was bad, and it was partially his fault. However, the one good thing to really come out of his time in the role is his sense of humor about his time in the role. I'm glad he's had a successful enough career that he can look back and joke on what ultimately almost ended that career.
But, you know, I thought at the time this was going to be a very good career move. It wasn't.
Since my Batman, I was disinvited from Comic-Con for 20 years. I wasn't a very good Batman. I'm the first one to say it.
I screwed it up so badly, I'm not allowed to weigh in on any of those subject matters anymore.
Didn't you apologize to the crowd at Comic-Con for Batman and Robin?
I always apologize for Batman.
I did have great nibble.
I need a name. Batboy, Nightwing. I don't know, what do you think? What's a good sidekick name?
I'm going to talk to you about everyone's favorite sidekick and the most underappreciated actor who ever portrayed him. Today, we're covering Chris O'Donnell's time as the boy wonder Robin. Robin may just be one of the most overlooked and underappreciated elements of the first four Batman films. While he's brought up in conversations, I find more often than not it skews more toward bad than good, but I personally don't think it's all that justified. There are a lot of problems with this particular performance, but there's also plenty of praise to raise down on it as well. When discussing Chris's time in the role, I find it's best to break it down into two parts, and those two parts being the two movies that he starred in as the character. It's the same role, the same actor in the role, and even the same director guiding that role? I don't know, I had to finish it. But there's a fine line between the Robin we got in Batman Forever and the Robin we get in Batman and Robin. In the first Schumacher Batman film, there was a lot more nuance to this performance. We're introduced to a young man who's just faced the same trauma that Bruce Wayne has. made to experience the very same pain that turned Bruce into Batman. Bruce selflessly steps in to provide for the young man, and silently guides him down a better path that he himself walks. But ultimately, the kid involves himself in Bruce's world, and goes completely against his wishes and aids him in his fight to stop crime. Try as Bruce may, he just can't seem to talk sense into this headstrong hero in training. In terms of being an accurate depiction of fiction's most famous sidekick, there are a couple things that separate this on-screen iteration from the character from the cartoon and comic panels. The most obvious of which being age. Chris O'Donnell was playing a character nicknamed the Boy Wonder at 25. Though the character in this continuity was supposed to be around 16 or 17 years old, it was still very obvious that he was being played by a man. A young man, mind you, but a man nonetheless. The aging up has its up and downs. This creative decision comes with a lot of benefits, but also with some blemishes as well. This was always a factor that I wasn't too sure of how it would look on the big screen. I think there's a level and several layers of reality removed when you're watching a cartoon kid get beat up in a fight, rather than watching an actual child in a costume be beaten by grown men. You know, one is a little bit easier to stomach than the other. It also makes Robin's decision to take on the whole crime-fighting gig feel more like it's his own decision, and also, it helps that he has some idea of the gravity of the situation. And just in general, I think it would have been a little bit harder to justify a 9-year-old karate-kicking those he comes up against. However, aging the character up does sort of convolute and confuse the dynamic of the dynamic duo. Certain integral plot points and story beats come off as laughable and completely unjustified. This orphan being taken in by Bruce Wayne is now very confusing. Being that Chris O'Donnell was already grown, this charity doesn't feel at all necessary. He was supposedly 17. He still had his circus family, even if he did just lose all his blood circus relatives. True, he wouldn't have seen a life of luxury before Bruce Wayne, but he would have been taken care of, I would think. In Batman Forever, they have a much more traditional mentor-protege relationship, while in Batman and Robin, the two are billed and treated as equals. Or at least Robin struggles to be seen as Batman's equal. Creative couldn't decide if Robin was supposed to be Batman's pseudo-son, or his potential younger brother. In the first movie, Batman takes Robin under his Batwing, but in the second movie, the two are at constant odds, with Robin wanting to be seen as being on Batman's level. Robin reads more like an annoying little brother desperately seeking his older sibling's validation. Despite the age difference, I think in a lot of ways Chris O'Donnell really personified Robin. Just maybe not the Robin that he was playing. While he may share a name and an origin story with the original Robin, Dick Grayson, personality-wise, he comes off much more like a Jason Todd. In the comics, the first Boy Wonder is a total Boy Scout. He and Bruce had their differences over time, but in his youth, he was just a good soldier, blindly following orders with very little resistance. He did what he was told and asked no questions. Of course, this is really just an oversimplification of the character, but he is remembered as the perfect sidekick. His successor, however, was kinda written to be the exact opposite. Jason Todd was an impulsive, and at times, selfish, immature brat. He had an attitude, and was just as likely to do his own thing as he was to follow orders. A character much more in line with the character that Chris O'Donnell played. It almost felt as if Schumacher's approach to the character was to make him a PG Jason Todd just with Dick Grayson's backstory. And if that was the intent, I would say he succeeded. Chris O'Donnell personified rebellious youth. He was a young man with an attitude problem and a chip on his shoulder. He had a retort and response for everything, even when he wasn't being asked a question. He's an adrenaline junkie that lives for the moment and treats every moment as if it were his last. He has a lust for life that your traditional do-gooder just doesn't. There's a clear, reckless nature to him that I think really helps emphasize and spotlight the character's youth and immaturity. The kid had a constant need for speed, shown to have a fondness for fast cars, fast bikes, and fast women. Not that there's anything wrong with that. Just saying, the guy was a total thrill seeker. And again, all of this much better describes the second Robin than it does the first. I'm not entirely sure that this was the intent, because I think the changes made to Robin were probably made to better reflect the times. You know, this was the Bart Simpson generation. We romanticized the rebel, and this Robin was symbolic of that. Unlike the second Robin from the comics, The first and only Robin from the movies wasn't as entirely hated. Dick Grayson, while being defiant and unruly, was never the outright menace that Jason was. He brought an energy to the role that redeemed him and made him somewhat charming. He was likable, and despite his fits, he was still someone that you wanted to see achieve. Point blank, this Robin was rough, but only around the edges. I think this change in personality also added to the character's credibility. Dick Grayson's background and risky behavior give him all the credentials he needs as a crime fighter. He has awesome acrobatic agility from years of being a circus performer. This gives him the ability to keep up with Batman on the battlefield that is Gotham City. His knowledge of all things car-related allow him to properly use the Bat-related vehicles. His daredevil antics determine his fearless nature. And he could fight because he was a punk kid and part-time carny. This attitude is not only fitting for the times, but also fitting for the story of the movie that he was in. Dick Grayson's unique set of skills were all justified, and given this specific upbringing, him stepping into the sidekick role seemed legitimate. While he and Bruce may seem like kindred spirits, brothers through bond, that's not entirely true. They can be contrasted just about as much as they could be compared. They both have a thirst for justice, but their sense of justice isn't entirely the same. Their method of going about achieving it is also different. As a matter of fact, initially this Robin's sense of justice ranges a lot closer to revenge. Desperately seeking to avenge his parents and kill their killer, he initially takes crime fighting at face value, wanting to engage with it to literally fight crime, to harm criminals, using it as a vessel to relieve himself of the pain of losing a parent. He doesn't involve himself outside of a need for justice, but instead out of a desire for revenge. Yet, this doesn't ruin the character. Yes, that's not the proper depiction of the Gold Star Boy Wonder, but man, is that on brand for a young man fueled by feeling instead of fact. Hopped up on emotions and casting logic aside, blinded by rage that's born from pain. Even if his intentions are good, he is still far too driven by anger. This turn of events I've always felt made Robin feel real. That's a very real reaction to such hurt and heartbreak, especially when it's happening to someone who's still developing. It isn't overly emphasized. As a matter of fact, I think a lot of this arc is downplayed because it probably was deemed a little bit too dark for what they were trying to sell. McDonald's cups. But it's still present in the product, and more importantly, in the performance. However, what's evident is that despite his shotgun approach to cape work, throwing fists before answering questions, this Robin still had the heart of a hero. In any given instant, even before he's been gifted a costume, this Robin never showed an ounce of hesitation when it came to the safety of others, for the sole fact it was the right thing to do. He was selfless to a fault. Even at his worst, this Robin is still heroic. He's still willing to sacrifice his safety, and maybe even his life, so long as it meant that he could save another. Regardless of his standoffish nature, he always meant well, instinctively standing up for the helpless, even when he doesn't necessarily have the means of doing so. This Robin leaps into action regardless of consequence. I think Alfred said it best.
But your father was right. You are a hero.
What's really clear when you're watching this character is that it's not meant to be a final product. Being as Batman Forever serves as Robin's origin story, this is only just the beginning. The movie really shows the importance of Bruce in Dick Grayson's life. He didn't just put a roof over his head, he gave him a proper path to follow, even if he did so begrudgingly. And Alfred, of course, also paved the way for this dynamic to play out.
I took the liberty, sir.
Without Bruce's influence, Grayson would have tried to take Two-Face's life without a second thought. I love the dynamic of this duo in the first movie. There's some really powerful moments between the two, and their whole narrative is one of the strongest elements of the whole film. In Robin, Batman sees himself, helpless, unexpectedly orphaned, alone. Batman sought out what he believed was justice, ending the life of the man who took the lives of his parents, only to forever be haunted by the event and the realization that he had become what he'd sworn to stop. He regrets his decision, and is actively trying to stop Robin from suffering that same fate. Batman tries to guide Robin, but Robin rejects his morals, opting to live by his own judgments. Eventually, the Dark Knight relents, and accepts that the Boy Wonder has to live by his own code. But when confronted with the opportunity to take Two-Face's life, he doesn't. At his own volition, he does things by the book. I really appreciate that. Because for me as a fan of the character, this always felt like a defining moment for the hero. This was a giant leap in the right direction. He was inching closer to being the Robin that we all know and love. There's a pretty strong and underspoken moment in the finale of Batman Forever, where Batman tosses false coins into the air, intentionally tricking Two-Face into falling to his death. This is Batman rewarding Robin for his decision by giving him exactly what he wanted, while still sparing him the burden of having murder on his conscience. Being that this is a burden that Batman already carries, he sort of sacrifices his soul to save his friends. Silently, that speaks volumes about the character's moralities, mentalities, and more importantly, their friendship. For what it's worth, I've always thought that with the tone of the movie and the time period that this was made in, Chris made for a pretty damn good Robin. He was believable in the role that he was given, and I think he brought a little bit of credibility to the character during a time when Hollywood was still unsure of him. I actually really appreciate this Robin. Not just Chris O'Donnell's time in the role, but even the window dressing of the character. Small details like having the original outfit and iconic design used as a circus look. Having that be the Flying Grayson's costume. It's not only accurate to the source, but it's also a nice nod to the fandom. Being done at a time where fan service really wasn't a thought. There's a lot to love with this Robin, but the issue with this praise only extends as far as the closing credits of Batman Forever. Because Batman and Robin, well, Batman and Robin was an entirely different experience. While I can safely say that aesthetically this was a big upgrade, giving Robin his Nightwing suit early, just now with a color swap and a cape, it's a pretty inspired choice. Overall, good look. Could have done without the nipples and the codpiece, but, you know, I mean, Joel Schumacher's directing, so you're gonna get that. Regardless, I would never snicker at the rest of the suit, because I think that it was surprisingly one of the coolest Robin costumes ever put to screen. I still think that it is one of the coolest looks Robin has ever gotten. If you could just overlook the codpiece and the rubber boobs, I'm telling you, the suit stands out. It's impressive. Far less impressive is the material he was given to work with in this movie. The best way to describe Batman and Robin would be to say that it is more rubber nipples than it is Nightwing chest plate. Anyway, while I do think the suit was a significant upgrade from the Robin costume in the last movie, everything else about the character really just felt like a major downgrade. And I mean this in just about every way imaginable. Like, all around bad. From a fighting standpoint, in Batman Forever he was holding his own and taking on street gangs before he was ever trained by Batman. And now he's having a hard time handling himself against Batgirl before she's been trained by Batman? Excuse me? This kid is getting his ass kicked by Alfred's niece? In terms of characterization, I wouldn't say that the character was drastically changed in the second installment. It somewhat felt in line with the character that was presented in the first film, but it lost all the charm that it carried. If you took all the bad qualities of the performance in Batman Forever, wiped out anything that made the character redeemable or even likable, that would be the Robin from Batman and Robin. Everything that made him special was missing, and in its place was an exaggeration of every negative quality present in the film prior. The character is depicted as being a whiny, selfish brat who puts his own personal needs as his top priority. He spends all of the runtime complaining that he's not as respected as Batman, but also not making any decisions or choices that Batman would make. So when the film finally acknowledges him as being on Batman's level, you kinda wish it didn't, because he's proved otherwise. He's been immature, he's been irrational. Why are we rewarding him? He argues with the Caped Crusader over the affections of a villainess, and then he sets his sights on the butler's pseudo-daughter. It's painfully obvious that Robin has nothing to do in Batman and Robin. And when he is given something to do, you really wish he wasn't. I actually think all the goodwill Batman Forever built up with the character was demolished by just how awful of a light he was painted in Batman and Robin. I truly think this Robin's bad reputation stems from Schumacher's second Batman film. But honestly, no one was good in that movie. How good could you be when you're in one of the worst movies ever made? It sort of speaks volumes to the substance of this iteration of the character that I was able to go on with paragraphs of praise in the first film, but I'm struggling to string along a couple sentences about his time in the second. There's really not that much to comment on. It's like going from passable to pass. Batman Forever provided a different but otherwise decent take on the Robin character. It got worse as time went on, but I will forever appreciate his performance in Batman Forever. Do I think he was the best Robin? No, absolutely not. But I certainly don't think he was the worst either. Chris O'Donnell is owed his due. He was the Robin of a generation, and I think he deserves to be brought up in the Cape conversation more.
And you are?
Batgirl.
That's not awfully PC. What about Batperson or Batwoman?
Bruce, it's me, Barbara.
It's kind of strange to think that this is still the only big screen Batgirl there's ever been. We've been close to one after, but that didn't turn out so well. As a matter of fact, this one didn't either. It even earned actress Alicia Silverstone a Razzie and a Stinker for Worst Supporting Actress, which, if I'm being entirely honest, doesn't feel entirely earned. In a movie this bad, how do you point to this particular performance and go, oh yeah, that's the problem? Especially when she played such a little part in the grand scheme of things. As a matter of fact, it's hard to even talk about this particular portrayal because there's barely a performance here to speak of. And that's not by chance either. Apparently a lot of Batgirl scenes in Batman and Robin were left on the cutting room floor. This is because Alicia Silverstone had gained a little bit of weight while filming. And I do mean a little. Still, because of this weight gain, the wardrobe department would have to refit her suit, as the caped costumes were a little too form-fitting. Because of this, her role was greatly diminished, so much so that she hardly plays a part in the plot. She's really just there to make sure the villainous Poison Ivy had a heroic equal. Can't have the girls fighting the boys, I guess. Even though we did that in a previous movie, might as well add one more in there. Unfortunately, I can't really say that she did anything of note here. She has about as much depth and importance to the narrative as Bane does. What makes matters even worse is that on top of having not much to do, due to eating one grape too many, the media had a field day when they found this out, referring to Alicia Silverstone as Fat Girl, which is not only really in poor taste, but is really off base.
Billy, get this kid into superhero shape.
Alicia Silverstone Batgirl?
He's that now.
And they weren't alone in their ridicule, as a disgruntled storyboard artist also took it upon himself to draw a crude picture of Silverstone during filming, a drawing which then got passed around on set. This same artist would then compare Alicia Silverstone in the Batgirl costume to Roseanne Barr trying to fit in at a Victoria's Secret fashion show. And this was the guy that was saying all that. Which, now makes sense because clearly he's a standard of beauty himself. And definitely not someone who spent most of his high school years looking on the outside of a locker that he was shoved into. I'm not saying that Alicia was above criticism, because this performance is far from perfect. As a matter of fact, just to make it clear, it's hardly even a performance. This girl is as clueless as the name of her hit movie. She seems really confused about what it is she should do. She also spends most of her screen time wide-jawed making goofy faces. Her mouth is moving, but there aren't any words coming out. The performance itself isn't anything to write home about. It's just a whole lot of nothing. I can't actually find any positives to speak of here. I just don't agree with all of the critiques that she was given. Especially the ones that seem to either be focused on the appearance of the person playing the part, rather than the performance of the person playing the part. Or how they harped on one mundane portrayal amongst a sea of awful adaptations and terrible iterations of characters. She's no worse than anybody else in this movie. As a matter of fact, I'd even argue that she's not as bad as some of the other heroes and villains that she shared a screen with. She was brought into a movie that was made not to tell a story, but instead to sell some toys. And it shows. Batman and Robin is a shameless, soulless 2-hour toy commercial, so it makes it hard to specifically blame Alicia Silverstone for her quote-unquote take on the Batgirl character. It seems like the movie itself didn't have an actual vision for her. She was only hired to be girl sidekick and beat up girl bad guy, and maybe sell an action figure or two. This is definitely a case where it wasn't the actor or actress that did an injustice to the character, but rather the movie itself. How can you blame the person in the part when the whole creative process seems intent on making the character completely unrecognizable? Despite this being the only live-action Batgirl to hit movie theaters, it almost feels inaccurate to say that. Because this wasn't Barbara Gordon, Commissioner Gordon's daughter. This was Barbara Wilson, Alfred Pennyworth's niece. Now, I can understand why this change may have been made. Making her a relative of Batman's butler definitely helps connect her to the dynamic duo a little bit better, especially when considering that in this continuity, Jim Gordon wasn't as close to the Dark Knight, or, well, even competent. The Commissioner is much more of a footnote in this set of films. He's a glorified background character, and maybe even calling it glorified is pushing it. So it makes more sense in trying to tie her into somebody with a much greater relationship to our hero. However, this change does muddy the waters, and it makes the character more foreign than it does familiar. Add on to it that the costume completely changed. No longer was there a cowl there masking her face like her mentor, but instead she was given a Robin replica eye cover. Aside from one scene where she's actually shown with the full mask, and she's using it as a helmet for when she's riding her Batcycle. Though this change apparently came later into development, as toy lines that coincided with the movie only depicted this specific look and nothing else. Apparently it was decided that it was much more important to see Alicia's long flowing hair than to actually make her look like the character that she's playing. And because of that, now she doesn't look like the character, act like the character, have the same background as the character, or even share that character's name. This isn't the Batgirl fans knew, and it wasn't one that they wanted to get to know either. Even original Batgirl actress, Yvonne Craig, voiced her displeasure. Not with the performance per se, but rather with the depiction, not being fond of any of the changes made to the character that she helped make iconic. And also not understanding why she'd even be included if those in charge were never going to give her anything to do. Now, despite all of this, I want to say that, shockingly enough, I think that there's some merit in casting Alicia Silverstone. She was never going to be the ideal Batgirl by any means. With all due respect, I don't think that she could have pulled off Barbara Gordon. Not that she was asked to, apparently. But I do think she could have pulled off Barbara Wilson, should they have actually put some attention or focus on that character. Or, even given it a direction. Alicia may not have met the criteria for Batgirl, but she definitely could have succeeded with the material of this movie. Her career-defining role in Clueless saw her play an over-the-top animated character brought to real life.
Ugh, as if.
So I don't at all blame anybody for thinking about casting her in this on-the-nose hammy laugh fest. But the problem here is that she didn't get into any of those goofy antics. The silliness of this movie plays out around her, with her being played off as serious, or at least an attempt at being serious. She should feel right at home here, but instead she just comes off as out of place, because she's never given a chance to show off her comedic abilities. She hardly ever makes an impression on audiences, let alone one strong enough to earn her 2 Worst Actress awards. I really think that this has less to do with her being the worst actress in this movie, and more to do with the fact that she took part in the worst Batman movie. In my personal opinion, she won these awards not by her own lack of talent, but by this movie's lack of entertainment quality. Unless watched ironically. When the movie is literally called Batman and Robin, even though it features the introduction and inclusion of a Batgirl, I think it's more than obvious that this character was always just an afterthought. And even calling it that might be given it too much credit. There are a lot of scenes and even story beats that were dropped from the film entirely. For starters, despite being referred to as Alfred's niece, in the original script and some of the scenes shot, it was emphasized that this wasn't by blood relation or even marriage. Instead, this was a term of endearment. She wasn't the daughter of Alfred's sister, but rather the daughter of the love of Alfred's life, someone he looked after and continued to do so from afar. I don't think this plot point makes or breaks the movie, but it certainly feels strange that this was altered in editing. Not that it really would have added anything special to either character, but at the very least it would have at least given her slightly more screen time. What's important to note is that when a sequel was initially pitched to Batman and Robin and was starting to be developed, there were seemingly no plans for the Batgirl character to appear in it, with no one bothering to ask Alicia to step back into the cape and cowless mask. The sequel instead would have followed the titular characters of this movie and completely left Batgirl out of the equation, further proving the point that there was no point in this character. Alicia Silverstone was asked to step into a role without rhyme or reason, aside from the fact that she was a name and the studio could get her. And that's just really upsetting. While Alicia would never return to the role, the suit would be brought back once more on the short-lived series Birds of Prey, though this time around painted and made to look a lot more like the costume of the character it was emulating. Cowl and all, at the end of the day, Batgirl deserved better. And you know what? So did Alicia Silverstone. Maybe she wasn't right for this part, but it's not like the project was doing a whole lot with this part to begin with. She could easily match the tone of the movie if they bothered to give her anything to do. With all that being said, if you like this video and want to see more deep dives into Batman movie performances, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
"Who is this Batgirl?"
Now, before I go, I don't usually do this. I've had a Patreon for a while now, but I've really struggled with what to do with it. Luckily, the time is upon us where I can actually offer you guys exclusive and extended content that I can't make here on the channel. With new restrictions on what kind of content can be monetized or hell, even shown here on the platform, now's as good a time as ever to be placing my completely unaltered, uncensored, extended videos on my Patreon. I don't want to put my videos behind a paywall, but that's kind of the best place to put them for the time being. So if there was ever a time to give a stranger money on the internet, well, I would like to think that now is that time. Just so everyone knows, all the money I make off my Patreon goes directly back into the channel. Everyone who donates to the Patreon will not be seen as a fan, but rather a producer of said content. And you will be credited as such in the closing credits here on the channel. So if you have the time and $1 to spare, help a guy out. If you can't, I appreciate your time and attention nonetheless.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time, same bat channel.